Hi, everybody. I'm Stephen Evans, FotoFest Executive Director, and welcome to another one of our latest in the series of Creative Conversations digital programs. Tonight, we're really happy to have two artists, or an artist and a poet, however you want to qualify it, on the program tonight that will be discussing an installation that has been part of the FotoFest Biennial 2020. As we begin, I just wanted to, as I always do, thank our funders. Major institutional and individual support for FotoFest and the Biennial 2020 was provided by the Houston Endowment, the Brown Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Texas Commission on the Arts, the City of Houston through the Houston Arts Alliance, the Philip and Edith Leonian Foundation, the Powell Foundation, the Wortham Foundation, David and Martha Moore, the WWW Foundation, Nina and Michael Zoka, the FotoFest Board of Directors, and supporters of the FotoFest Annual Fund. I also want to thank supporters of the meeting place and the 10 by 10 exhibition, and I'll explain the relationship in just a moment. But those supporters include the Whitehall Houston Hotel, Foundation for a Civil Society, the Wing Foundation, the Institut d'Etudes Baleariques, and Art Houston magazine. The project that we're talking about tonight was part of our exhibition called 10 by 10, and it consists of 10 bodies of work that are chosen by 10 of our reviewers from 2 years prior, our 2018 Biennial and Meeting Place Portfolio Review. And we select a group of 10 diverse reviewers, curators, publishers, editors, etc. And we ask them to tell us what their most significant reviews were that they came across in that year. And then from that, we build this exhibition of 10 bodies of work. And one of the registrants was Ali Hauslein, the Associate Director of Pier 24 in San Francisco. Great place. If you're anywhere on the West Coast, after all this mess is done, you've got to go to Pier 24. It's a wonderful institution to visit. And Ali chose the work of David Johnson and his collaboration with Philip Matthews. It's a fascinating project called Wig Heavier Than a Boot. And I'm just going to read, well, first I'm going to introduce the artist. So David Johnson's an artist, educator, and curator based in Iowa City, Iowa. He received his MFA in visual art from Washington University in St. Louis in 2007 and earned his BFA in studio art with an emphasis on photography from Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas. Johnson's monograph, Wig Heavier Than a Boot, was published in 2019 by Chris Graves Project. And we'll also be discussing the monograph and its relationship to this project. His photographs have been exhibited internationally, including the Contemporary Art Museum St. Louis, the Mildred Lane Kemper Museum in St. Louis, the Fort Wayne Museum of Art in Indiana, and Rathaus in Stuttgart, Germany. Don't Take Pictures, the Humble Arts Foundation, Lens Scratch, Photo Emphasis, and Fraction Magazine have all featured his work, among other publications. And currently, Johnson is visiting assistant professor of photography at the University of Iowa. His collaborator, Philip Matthews, is a poet from Eastern North Carolina and is the author of Witch, which came out in 2020, and co-author of the aforementioned Wig Heavier Than a Boot. Individual poems by Matthews have appeared in Poetry Northwest, Tusculum Review, Denver Quarterly, Connotation Press, Sonora Review, and elsewhere. Anchored by site-specific meditation and performance, his practice investigates spirituality, queer power, eco-consciousness, and questions of home. And Matthews received their MFA, in writing from Washington University in St. Louis and their BA in English from Tulane University, New Orleans, Louisiana. I mentioned Ali Hauslein earlier, the Associate Director of Pier 24 Photography, who was the reviewer that suggested this project for the exhibition. And she wrote a wonderful essay that we had in the gallery. And I'd just like to read from the first paragraph of that, because it's a great way to introduce the project, and then we'll get into the questions and the discussion between David and Philip and myself. This is from Ali's introduction to the work. Photographer David Johnson was first introduced to Petal, a female persona performed by the poet Philip Matthews, at a residency that both artists attended. The duality fascinated Johnson. Quote, "My interest in seeing Phil develop and Petal come through lies in the tension between the author and the character, and how the character becomes the author," he says. "I was intrigued by Matthews' writing process and what the marriage between word and photograph could be." And Ali continues, "From that chance encounter, a multi-year collaboration was born. Their resulting project, Wig Heavier Than a Boot, explores Petal's use of image and word, recontextualizing conventional ideas and spaces in both photography and poetry, particularly with respect to gender and identity, through a more nuanced, flexible, and inclusive lens." And so now I'm going to turn it over to the artist, and Philip Matthews is going to introduce some writing, and that will be our entry into Wig Heavier Than a Boot. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here and speak with everyone.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing Ali into the room as well. I was going to introduce a little bit about the project, but I feel that that text by Ali does that. So I think maybe the best way to meet this persona that I've called into the room to help me write poems since 2012, named Petal, is just to jump right into some of the poems. And I thought, just because it feels right with the world upside down right now, to start with the last poem in the book. It's called A Weapon in Beauty's Disguise. A thick forest, a fire dying by daybreak before the sun's rupture like a dancing foot. The brittle-boned trees splinter. It is winter and a trace of snow disrupts the ground. The hoof of my sleeping heart in the tent, as wild hens tatter the ground in long, lush gowns and nude flashes of skin where the roosters have picked. In covers, a flash of bone and ankle water as I wade out of the dream. Before daybreak, there is no need to fear what is seen, which is why I will follow a keen face Petal, walking around already nearby, by the river and mountain when I wake. As a kid, I walked these woods, Petal by my side in her apple print dress and netting, hat-shaped, like a stone, thistle elbows helping her keep balance in her overgrown heels. I was the man, and she was Petal. Imaginary, she did not have to worry about such things as hiking gear, no twist of her ankle on the climbing rock, no scuff of her dress, as she could fly at will. Whereas I scraped my knees and bullied my body into tiny fixtures, odd angles as I grasped at flat rock, balls of my feet digging upwards, a grit of teeth, and pulling myself with willow arms towards a burning bush, to give myself to for the burning. A voice at the top sheet would help me to hear, fleshing with krill, a multitudinous high-pitched voice, which is not what I had expected. What did the voice say? Something about forgery and murder, something about jealousy and worship, workshops of shamans giving over their wood replicas, something about being human and betrayal and kissing in a garden growing snakeskin. I fell to my knees in relish, smokescreen over my eyes. I was born, Petal lifting me 3 feet in the air. Now she bathes me. Petal. As the hens go clucking in their myopic smudge, the undergrowth squirming a thin plate, I say to one, "Sister, come over. I will kill and feed you to his body. Your smoke will find him arrive with mouth wet to stir the onions and see you hot in the cream, the daylilies bulbing with garlic. You will be nourishing and plenty for day. I will be nourishing and plenty for night. We will do our parts, preparing his body for healing and walking towards God. What he thinks is God, I will be there when he finds it is me shaped to his organs. I will stay close by a long time. Here, chicken, what I do is a corpse you will like. Even as we turn to say, leave us, this world is leaving us. The forest floor taught me to eat, but it was not until I breathed, I thought. And then I'll just read one more. It's one of the self-portraits. There are 5 or 6 self-portraits that run through the book version of the project. And it was really interesting to me, this idea of sort of becoming Petal in the mirror and engaging with her in that way. But then of course, going out into the world, and like any of us, once we go out into the world, we can't see ourselves. And so David's photographs became kind of a more objective record of her presence, and having her reflected back at me through the form of David's photographs taught me so much about who she is. So the self-portraits are my understanding of her in the mirror, juxtaposed with David's understanding of her via the photographs. So here's one of them, self-portrait. Watching Petal like a monk or fire waiting to disappear. Petal will want to open her eyes behind mine, her beak, her voice at my throat, sappy, relentless, soft and pretending almost the consistency of skin. Bees could not tell the difference. An entire coast and an unfurled leaf of her inviting me to swim, legs like a wrench. Petal is stitching the water. She will take me under slash. If a tongue should also be involved in the tragedy, answer for it and pray over its paltry body, a hum in your eyeballs on horizon.
Thank you, Philip. That's great. And thanks for establishing more of the context too. That was very good for us, I think. And further to that, I wanted you both to address how the collaboration began, and it's a 5-year project, so it must have evolved over time. So I wonder if you both could address that, talk a little bit about that.
Phil, I was wondering if you wanted me to start and talk about all the way up to the first shoot, and then you kind of fill in about Worm Farm.
That sounds great.
First, I apologize. I'm having a little bit technical difficulties during the slideshow. I've lost my mouse. So Philip and I, as Ali mentioned, started the collaboration took root at this residency called Float in 2014, and it was organized by a St. Louis nonprofit called The Luminary, and it was led by an Italian collective called Radical Intention. And part of this workshop residency was to learn listening strategies and kind of understand where radical optimism can play a role in our practice. And one of the exercises for this long weekend was to share each other's practice. And Ali had mentioned very beautifully that I had heard Phil talk about these petal poems and creating this persona. And I was really intrigued by that idea of artists creating another way or another avenue of working to create a persona, to write a different type of poem. And that intrigued me. Philip and I had known each other through the St. Louis art world for several years. We had actually been in a couple of performance pieces together, and we ended up, Philip had presented this project around a campfire, and later I was like, would you want to do a collaboration? And we actually, Phil said yes, thankfully, and we would meet for brunch for 6 to 8 months, talking about what this could be and what it would mean and how Petal plays a role and what Philip's role. And Philip was interested in working with me because my recent exhibition at the Contemporary Art Museum, where I had photographed donors' homes, the gallery museum, and the museum's offices to talk about this kind of institutional critique. And I think he was interested in understanding what Petal's home would be. And through our brunch conversations, we originally thought it would be Petal on a throne with a Mad Hatter tea party meets Andy Warhol factory party in the middle of the woods. And we decided to do a couple of test shoots, and there's a photograph. It's the second photograph that we saw in the slideshow. It was the second photograph in the slideshow, and it's Philip touching his nose, and we realized that it was going to be a lot more introspectful of a project. And so we kind of responded back to that, and Philip had a residency at the Worm Farm Institute, and I'll let him kind of take it from there.
Yeah, so I actually, funnily enough, I've returned to the Worm Farm Institute, which is an arts nonprofit in rural Sauk County, Wisconsin. I'm this year's director of programs, but my first introduction to the place was as a resident poet for 6 weeks in the summer of 2015. Artists and writers from all over the country come and engage the workings of a small vegetable farm. So you're working 15 hours a week in the farm. And I wanted to do it just because it seemed totally outside of my personality. And really, I didn't write so much when I was here, but the thing that I did every morning after farm work, the artist and I, fellow residents and I would eat an enormous lunch after physical labor. And then I would go up to my studio and I would become Petal for the rest of the day. And just wander around the landscape, spending time with, like, there was a herd of cows on the property, taking long walks, spending time with the other artists in their studios, and just experiencing what it was to go through the day as her. And those experiences really morphed the way that I was thinking about her, and also the way that I was thinking about myself. I think for me, this project has been a way of reconciling an identity as a queer person to these kinds of rural spaces. And also thinking about having grown up in the Bible Belt, coming from a small town in eastern North Carolina, that I fled my home as soon as I could because I felt that I wasn't able to belong there. And so enacting these experiences as Petal on a rural farm were incredibly important in the way that I was thinking about the project. So Dave came for a weekend and we did a video shoot as well as several photo shoots there. And that really unlocked the rest of the project. 2016 was a huge photography year. I think that we did something like 5 shoots in a year in various places in Wisconsin, Missouri, North Carolina. Dave came home with me for the holidays, and Petal met my family, and Dave met them as well. So yeah, this project really unfolded, but I think that 2015 and this experience at Worm Farm totally redirected the project. As Dave mentioned, it became more introspective, and it also became more interested in queer drag performance outside of the city.
One of the fascinating things about the project, and you touched on it, is the mix of settings, these pastoral settings, a coastline, but also within the space of architecture. And I wondered, and the settings become another character in all of this to me. And I was wondering if you all could talk about what those settings represent for you and your relationship to them. And I think you've begun talking about that, about your background in North Carolina, but if you could elaborate, I'd be very interested.
Yeah, for sure. How do I want to answer it? I mean, I think a large piece of it is what I was just speaking to about where queerness belongs and how queer people belong. And for me personally, trying to feel that I had every right to belong to the place that I'm from and the family that I'm from. And even, quite frankly, I was raised in the Southern Baptist Church, and while I have qualms with it, feeling that I have every right to that lineage as well. And so much of that is tied to place. So that's a big part of the answer for me. But more broadly, those sort of empty landscapes, whether it was the middle of a farm or a field or the Atlantic coastline in the middle of December when nobody is out, because they were expansive and because they were more or less isolated, I feel that they allowed for a kind of intimacy to swoop into the performance. One of the questions that I had over and over in this project was, for whom am I performing this body? And the two answers that always came in were, one, for myself, because for some reason, I need to explore this relationship with this other side of my psyche. And two, I'm performing them for David. And if anybody else sees the photographs, whether in exhibition form or if anybody happened to come across us as we were making the shoot, fantastic. But if not, that would have been okay too. Like, there was something about having a straight man be generous enough and curious enough about this relationship that is exploring ideas of queerness and gender, for him to witness me in this inquiry and hold space for it was one of the greatest, really and truly one of the greatest gifts. And the landscape, because they were sort of isolated and empty, they allowed for that. They allowed the literal space for that to happen.
Thank you. In a sense, and you began talking about this in your response, and I'd like David to chime in on this too. In a sense, we all perform for the camera when there's a camera present. And in this work, I'm interested in the collaborative aspect and finding out, was Petal performing and David was documenting, or did David have also a role in directing the performance that was playing out in front of the camera?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. When Philip and I started this project, I think at first we were trying to navigate who we were to each other and kind of developing our friendship and our artistic bond. But understanding Worm Farm having this place, the freedom of access to kind of walk through the landscape was beneficial. But I'm using a 4x5 field camera, so it's a very slow process. And at the start of the project, as Phil's conjuring Petal, you can see there's moments where either one of them are uncomfortable being in front of the camera. And there's a lot of, at the start, I think, me staring at them for a while until maybe a more authentic pose for Petal would come forward, or Philip would allow Petal to fully kind of embrace. But there's also times that Petal maybe wasn't comfortable to perform, and either changing the idea of the shot around or changing the venue or just stopping the shoot completely and being aware of that. I don't know, Max, if you could pull up, there's a photograph of Petal on top of a fort.
And that man behind the curtain is Max Fields, our associate curator, who's helping us run the program tonight.
Yeah, there we go. So, as we talked about these locations being really important, going to North Carolina with Philip, not only understanding and learning from his family and his back story, but also being around these places that he grew up around, this becomes a really important photograph for us. This is maybe our first shoot in a very public place that's open. There's people that there's a family that had just walked around the corner of this fort. Petal is wearing a pretty purple wig and being followed around behind with somebody with a very large wooden camera. And there's people were looking and observing, and I was very aware of and conscious towards Philip's presence and how comfortable Petal was within the scene. And early in the day, there had been a moment where I was watching Home Alone 2 with Philip's mom and sister, and Philip's mother had asked to borrow Petal's mascara and seeing that touching moment, and then going into this really public situation and understanding the landscape and the uncomfortable situation that we had found ourselves in, and kind of asking Petal to take some distance from the camera and walk into the fort and get above what looks like a prison cell, was kind of a moment that was eye-opening for me to understand the realms of comfort in my role as a photographer, not to only, really ask for the subject to do these things, but also knowing when I need to give them space and time to process. So I think it's a lot of watching Philip and Petal kind of respond to each other. As we move through the project in later shoots, it's very comfortable and there's very clear delineation between Philip and Petal and the performance that they're making. And then our final shoot was solely Philip and myself kind of directing the shoots. We had been suggested that we kind of lost ourselves in the work, and Petal had kind of taken over. But I'll let Philip kind of follow along with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that is really important to mention to this question is that I do think that there was a way in which Dave was able to see her more clearly than I could. There would be experiences, so for example, earlier in the day that this photo was taken, we were on the shoreline, and there was a moment where I just felt like totally her. And we took a photo and I thought, oh, that's the one. Do you know what I mean? This is going to be like the one photo that we're going to love from this day. And then when we got it back, I realized that in fact, it was a terrible photo. You know what I mean? So my internal performative experience was not being, it wasn't translated actually on the film. And so I think that I really relied on David to tell me what he was seeing. I think that Dave is such a master of light in photography. And so often I was very open to sort of like, yeah, tell me how I need to move my body to find the light that you're seeing. So while I have my sort of natural gestures and Petal has hers, and of course they show up in the photo, I do think that both of us were ultimately open to taking direction from David, recognizing that he was seeing something that there was no way that we could.
And how did you decide on the settings and where the shoots would take place? I'm curious about that as well.
Yeah, so it's kind of access and opportunity. Max, if you could go down to the next slide, where Philip had the residency at Warm Farm. I was part of the board of directors for Paul Art Space, which is a residency in St. Louis, which were both places that we photographed in and had access to walk around expansive landscapes and spend time in finding the right area to photograph in. There's a series of images that were made in caves that are across the river from St. Louis that were man-made caves. And that was partly to directly quote from F. Holland Day's Visions, the Orpheus scene. And thinking about, there's an essay by Sean Michelle Smith that talks about photography between desire and grief, and kind of recalling that image. I think on the slideshow, it's slide 14, is one of the cave photographs.
There we go.
Yeah, so this is one of the cave photographs that was in direct reference to F. Holland Day's work and the way in which Sean Michelle Smith had wrote about that photograph in that series.
You want me to read that quote? It's so good.
Yeah,
Sure.
if you got it. Yeah.
So she's speaking about one of Day's photographs. As Orpheus emerges from the underworld, he also enters a new phase in his life. According to Ovid's version of the myth, after losing his wife, Orpheus forswears women and begins to take young male lovers. Thus, Orpheus's return to Earth is also the moment of his birth into homoeroticism. Out of desire and grief, another desire is born, and out of that new desire also springs another grief, for Orpheus comes to a terrible end. Enraged by his rejection of women, Dionysian priestesses attack him and tear him to pieces. They throw his head into the river where it floats, still singing, to the island of Lesbos. It's so good.
It's great. let's, I'm curious as to how audiences have reacted. And there's been a huge shift in the way that drag and in a related but not the same way, trans identity has been embraced in popular culture over the last few years and has become more understood and more consumed by a greater public. So I'm wondering if you've noticed over time a shift in that, and did it affect the project at all as it developed over the 5 years? And what's it been like since you've started showing it?
Really good question. You know, in a way, Petal definitely started. She started entering into my practice as a character in 2012, and then because I was so enthralled with the St. Louis art scene, you know, I was going to, drag scene. I was going to weekly drag shows that were curated by Tyler Cross, aka Siren, who's now in New Orleans. I started playing around with drag, not necessarily to perform in that way, but just for the hell of it, you know. But I early on set a parameter for myself that my makeup would only come from stores that my grandmother's mother and sister had access to growing up, to sort of keep with that idea of drag performance in rural areas. And so, you know, I never have owned anything from MAC or Lush. Everything has come from Walgreens or CVS. So I think that, yes, this project is using elements of drag, and I definitely have gone down rabbit holes of sort of YouTube tutorials hosted by, you know, like RuPaul's Girls, as a way of just like learning information. But I also think that it is interested in not exactly fitting into that context. So that's I just think it's important to note that. But nothing wrong, nothing against drag. I love that kind of performance. It's just something that Petal never seemed exactly interested in matching. And in terms of like how the work has been received, one of my favorite shows that we've done was in LaGrange, Texas, where most of the attendees were older, and they had such sincere and beautiful questions about gender and gender expression and identity that on the one hand, I feel I could have bristled at, but those questions didn't come from a place of malice. They came from a place of real authentic curiosity. Like, I want to understand what this is about. Mm-hmm. And that may have been my favorite show because of that, because the reaction was just so pure in a way, so open in a way.
How many times has there been a performance of Petal in relationship to the material that's been written for A Wig Heavier Than a Boot? Or why don't you talk about that process? Actually, I think that's really fascinating, that the poems are in some way generated by the shoots and what happens in the shoots.
Yeah,
I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, Dave, do you want me to keep talking, or do you want to?
I think talk about the writing of the work. And
I have a follow-up for Dave after, okay, good. So okay. Don't worry.
Okay, so it was very important to both Dave and I, that Dave and me, that this wasn't going to be a typically ekphrastic project. And so it wasn't going to be Dave takes a photograph and then I write a poem about it, or vice versa, that both forms were going to be rooted in the present moment of being together. The three of us, the three presences sort of out in the world, Dave directing the photograph and Petal / me writing sort of literal or mental performance notes that would give way to the poem. I think increasingly that is just a part of my practice, that I'm very interested in having a kind of meditative or somatic performative experience, and taking notes that lead to the poem, and the final sort of like container of the poem still containing traces of that process. I hate poems that feel overly revised. I think that too much editing kills the thing that was trying to press through in the first place. And so I'm really interested in poets like C.A. Conrad and Banu Kapil, who I feel are finding ways of leaving the electricity of the process in the container of the poem. So those two poets especially
Right.
were on my mind during this project.
And you mentioned them when we talked earlier. I think that the poetry and the performance of the poetry is one expression of the project, and then I know of at least two other expressions of the project. One is what appears in the gallery, which is a wonderful salon style hanging. And then there's the book, Wig Heavier Than a Boot, published by Chris Graves Projects, and I think there's still copies available through that website, right?
Just a few.
And that's a really beautiful book, and the images and the poetry have a very kind of equal weight in that project too. And I was just wondering, I wanted to, and I think this is a question for David, I wanted to know a little bit about the installation strategy and the different sizes of the images and how you've chosen to present them on the gallery wall. And then, but also I wanted you both to talk about the collaborative process going into the book and how that came together.
As far as the installation process, I think being in the collaboration, having conversations, and Philip and I have probably two different understandings of. I have a very maximal idea of installation, and Philip has a very minimal, and so trying to meet those two ideas, but also trying to stay true to the poetry. There's three different sizes of images. 8 by 10, 11 by 14, and or I'm sorry, 16 by 20 and 24 by 30. And a lot of that is to reference Philip's cadence in delivering the poetry as it rises and falls, as we've witnessed earlier in this talk. So that's one of my nods to kind of Philip's expression. Philip generally is very interested in having just a few poems because there's oftentimes a reading or multiple readings within the gallery setting. A lot of times we will also have video to create a soundscape of Philip reading poems through a video piece that fills the gallery space as well. So it's another avenue to view the images and hear the poetry. We've often tried to put the poems on the wall on vinyl text or whatnot, and generally that doesn't work very well. But it's always in a way to think of that this expression of the poem and the photograph is about rhythm. And the book container has all 34 photographs and all 26 poems. Every exhibition that we've put on has been a different variation between the photographs, the sizes that they come in, and the rhythm that they're put on. So they're very site-specific installations. And a lot of it is to try to understand ways in which we can navigate a narrative. You can read the book, you can look at the book, and it's digestible with one photograph and one poem at a time, or you can take in the whole thing. There's not really one clear beginning to end, and I think that is echoed within the exhibitions too. You can kind of navigate as you see fit when you experience the work.
I think that's a beautiful way to talk about it. And I think that, at its base, this project is about identity and narrative. And that the way you've chosen to present it, and I was really fortunate that, David, that you and I could meet in Portland, prior to the project coming to Houston, and really talk about those things, because I think it presents a faceted view of identity and narrative, which is how we can experience. But I love the fact that you are visually referencing the cadence of Philip's poetry. And you know, in the book, I was able to see Philip's handwritten poetry, and there's also a cadence to that, as well as just to the cadence of the written poems. So I think that's really beautiful. And how did you decide on how the poems and the photographs matched? Was that something that came out of the notational thinking that led to the poems, and where it's not ekphrastic, but there's a relationship to a shoot and particular notes?
Mhm.
I'm just curious about how that happened and developed.
I don't, you know, to be honest, I don't even know that I have a clear memory of how it happened. I just know that it did. I know that at some point we sort of like looked at the edit of photos and the edit of poems individually as sort of like separate arcs, and thought, okay, yes, this order of photos feels right and this order of poems feels right. And so now it's about going in and allowing both of those arcs to exist interwoven. And I think that our book designer had great ideas about how to do that. I do.
Amy Thompson.
Yes,
Sorry.
Amy Thompson had great ideas about that, and I think was invaluable in that process. I do remember sitting at my friend house sitting for my friend Francine, and sort of like laying out all the poems on the floor and playing around with the order of them, which is something that I think a lot of poets do. Yeah, but I think for me, the big
People
thing.
that edit art books have to do that too.
Yeah.
It's a very
I think-
similar process, I think, in the end.
Yeah.
I think one thing to consider is that this is a very slow process. As Phil mentioned earlier, we're doing 1 or 2 shoots a year for 4 or 5 years. And, you know, I'd show Phil an edit of the photographs, and then he'd show me new poems, and quickly a photograph would leave or a poem wasn't clear. And so we had kind of built up a sequence, and through going through portfolio reviews, I think I had kind of gotten a clear sense of how the people are reading the photographs alone, and then allowing for the poetry to fill really important gaps. And there's the moment, I think it's on the 3rd or 4th spread, when you see Philip's handwriting, and it's just another one of those eye-opening moments of peeling back a layer within this project. Like the moment that Philip touches his nose, and we know it's going to be introspectful, to 4 years later and 3 spreads in the book, you realize that it is actually about this idea of identity, and how do we balance the power between author, character, and observer. And it was very generous of Philip, and also Amy and Chris, through the publishing process of, we kind of had everything ready, and then we said go, and it all just kind of fit together really succinctly.
I'm really enjoying this time with you both, but I'm seeing that we have quite a few questions. I'm gonna switch to them, and some of them are questions that I share. So we'll start with a question from Madeline Sy, and Madeline asks, "Can you speak more to the decision to shoot in black and white, especially since you described Petal's outfits as being very vibrant? For example, the purple wig."
Phil, do you want me to take that?
Yeah, if you would.
So I had been working on an earlier project, photographing the Kerrville Folk Festival in Central Texas. This was an 18-day long event, and photographing black and white. And I brought that into the conversation with Philip, partly because there was, because of Petal's outfits being kind of this very thrift store chic and lots of color, a lot of the photographs that were colored turned into fashion shoots, and that wasn't a world that we were trying to reference or think about. Also, maybe not even a world that Petal would really want to be a part of in a way. I think she likes to toil in the landscape. And so I think that was one way. I think there's also, as Philip was navigating, learning how to place Petal's makeup on and her face on, the black and white images were,
They were kind.
they were kind, as we were learning this process of how does Philip conjure and become Petal. And I think for me, it's also trying to echo looking at Philip's, just the black ink on white paper, and and letting these images speak to a sense of timelessness. And that Petal kind of is of the now, but she's also from, we talk about Anne Brigman's Soul of the Blasted Pine from 1907, and I really think that Petal and Anne Brigman like drank whiskey on a fire together and talked about these things. So
Would
I think
you would you admit to any romanticism about the history of photography, David Johnson?
yes, I would say that as a photo educator, I am very tied to romanticizing the history of photography in probably more ways than I
Oh.
should.
You know, that cave image that you showed, and the reference to F. Holland Day, it's all right there. It's you see that, and it's really terrific and fantastic. There's another really interesting question for me that came from Roberto Tejada, and Roberto asks, the dialogue between Philip and Petal seems palpable in the photographs and your descriptions of the photographic occasion and interactions with David. It's fascinating to wonder about the editing process for the series that became wig heavier than a boot. To what degree do Philip and Petal participate in the selection or exclusion of images and their placement in the sequencing? And how do the photographer and subject view the non-Petal images as critical for establishing a particular mood?
Maybe I'll speak to the latter question, Dave, and then
Okay.
you can speak to the former. So
Yeah.
I feel like in terms of the non-Petal images, well, I guess there are two kinds, right? There are the me images, like the poet images where she isn't present, and they, I think are just important because so much of this project, as Dave has spoken to, is about tracking the relationships between these three presences: the poet, the persona, and the invited observer. But the images that are beach grass, or the house, the cow skull, I think are providing a kind of texture and a kind of sort of like symbolic resonance that is related to what metaphor does in poetry, and also is sort of like tracking this kind of like tracking Petal's presence almost in this kind of talismanic way, that even though she's not there, she is, because of the kind of object that's being photographed, and also the connotations that we have, the cultural connotations that we have around those objects.
Sure.
And I think in terms of like how much I and Petal participated in the selection or exclusion of images, very much, but I'll let Dave speak to that.
Yeah, I think it's really important to acknowledge that this is a really true collaboration. There wasn't one moment when anybody was taking on more of a role. Granted, there's technical roles of I can't write a poem to save my life. Philip does that, and but I think Philip also, when we started this project, was a curator of the Pulitzer Arts Foundation. So his knowledge of the visual art world is expansive. And there are times that we would look at images and discuss, like there are images in the series and in the book that I wasn't thrilled about, but they pointed to Philip's insecurity of being Petal early on, or they pointed to this moment that neither one of them were quite performing, that there's a vulnerability there that's necessary. So I think, as we picked locations, we would talk about outfits together, and we would talk about, different things, and we'd kind of throw ideas back and forth. But in the sequence, it was really trying to understand what's the best way to give Petal the space that she needs to be and thrive. And I guess there's also that question of the particular mood question. And for me, as Philip may not conjure Petal anymore, Petal's still there in these photographs in a way. She's still There's a photograph of kind of a thicket, and Petal's still very much tied to that. And I think that's conjuring her spirit within those photographs is really important to be true to landscape. But also working with Philip is a very different way of an editing process. Philip, the poet, may bring in a line or a word that was written in a sketchbook or a journal years prior. And there's actually photographs in the series that I didn't make for the project that found a home here. There's a photograph of a barn in Iowa that I photographed in 2013 before we even started, and we realized that that would function as Petal's home. Or there's a photograph of a boot that was taken in Texas, which is part of my home and my personal history that kind of gets impressed upon this series. But it also speaks to the project, and maybe even understanding the relationship to the landscape too.
And well, you mentioned the boot, and I wonder if we could talk about the title of the project for a moment.
Yeah. So I think that partly it's just to speak to a kind of like surreality that is prevalent in the project, and certainly I think in most poetry. But also for me, there is something about that's something that is traditionally associated with the feminine, a wig having more substance or having more power than something that is associated with the masculine, a boot. Mm-hmm. That feels very important to me. And also there's a kind of violence inherent in my mind. As I was thinking about this title, I was like, okay, well, how would you even know that a wig is, or like, how would you know that a boot is heavy? Like, when would a boot be on your head? And the idea of being kicked came to me. And so I think that there's something powerful and queer about the title for me. And I also recognize that because the title has this kind of delicious ambiguity, it's using something that poetry does best, which is to have these sort of like invitations to have multiple interpretations come into it.
Thank you. Confirming some of my suspicions about that. We hadn't talked about that before. Laurel Radzeski asks, how did you know when the project was done? And did the conversation between the two artists reach a form of conclusion, or was it through another way?
I guess I can speak to the first question, and Phil, you want to take the latter part. We had thought we were actually done before we were done. And I had a consultation with Sasha Wolf, and she looked at the work and said, "You've lost yourself, and Philip doesn't have a voice. Petal's kind of taken over." And it was a really powerful critique to look at it. And by then, Philip and I had both left St. Louis and had both started working on other projects. And so we had decided to come back to St. Louis for one more shoot, and went specifically to the Pulitzer Arts Foundation where Philip had worked. We went to an LGBTQ church and made these photographs. And actually, the first photograph in the book, Foundation 110, where Philip is laying face down in the series, is the last book, or the last photograph that we made in the series, which is the next photograph after it. Philip touching his nose with the first photograph. So it becomes a little bit circular, but it became very apparent that we just needed to have this presence of maybe being a little bit more traditional in the photographer directing the shoot. But little did we know, here we have Philip as Philip desiring to lay down face down into this bamboo rooftop garden. And I'll let Philip kind of talk about that experience, and that Petal was there too.
Yeah, I mean, I think in that particular photo, there was such a clear, I think it was the moment in the project, one of the moments in the project where I felt the most like, oh, this is what this shoot has to be. and taking control. And there was just such a clear like sense of lying face down in this bamboo. It's the bamboo garden at the Pulitzer Arts Foundation on the roof. And that was just going to be it. And I felt sort of like, even though I hadn't sort of like dressed as Petal or put on her makeup, her presence was there in that kind of like direct, like, no, do this now. Also, I just want to say, sorry, hi, Laurel. I'm really glad that you're here. So Laurel Rudzinski was a fellow poet with me at the Worm Farm in summer 2015. So happy that she's here and asking a question. And speaking of brilliant persona poems, check out her book, Red Mother, which are poems written from the perspective of parasites infecting their hosts. Many of them are love poems.
She says hello back.
So, yes, so did the conversation between Dave and I reach a form of conclusion? Yeah, kind of, I think. There was just this natural moment in which I felt personally like the Petal project for me was finished, in the sense of like, I don't want to dress as her and perform for a camera anymore. And so there was just sort of this natural, it felt like she had left the room. As a presence, as a persona, it felt like she had left the room. And people, as we've given these kinds of talks, have asked, would you ever consider sort of like performing as her? And the answer, I've asked myself many times, the answer continues to be no, because it feels like to do that now would just be some sort of like cheap marketing ploy. Do you know what I mean? To shop the project around. I feel that when I was engaging these performances, it was because like something deep in my soul needed to do it. And we did it, and, you know, so fortunate to have had Dave be a part of it. But now that it's complete, it's complete. And so while it's strange that suddenly she's kind of invisible, just as the project is becoming more visible in the world, that also feels weirdly right to me.
Terrific. Well, I think that's a good place to conclude with Petal leaving the room. I want to thank you both for this great talk, and also the project. It's really been an honor for me to work with that project, and I was very, very pleased about it. And it's been great to learn even more about it now. And I wanted to thank Roberto, Madeline, and Laurel for their questions. And I also wanted to read, one of the great things about this is, and one of the pluses of the fact that we're now doing digital programs, we can reach wider. We can reach people from all over the country and outside the country. And the community shows up. And so I wanted to let you know that Gina Grafos wrote Most Fulfilling Moment of the Week. Thank you for your collaboration and sharing the work. From YouTube, Susan Moore wrote, thank you for your creativity and vulnerability in this work. Another YouTube comment, such a beautiful project. Hearing about the collaboration process is fascinating. Thank you for sharing so beautifully. Best A Fields from Vincennes University Photography. And there were a lot of great names, friends in the attendees list. So thanks again for helping us convene this community. It's really very special for us. And then I wanted to mention, as people are getting ready to sign off, we have a number of more Creative Conversations digital programs coming up. The next one is on Wednesday, June 3rd at 12 p.m. Central Time, and that's Faisal Abdu-Allah with Mark Seeley. Mark Seeley was the curator of the African Cosmologies Biennial Central Exhibition, and Faisal Abdu-Allah was one of the featured artists. So they'll be talking again on Wednesday, June 3rd, 2020 at 12 p.m. Then after that, on Saturday, June 20th at 2 p.m., I'll be in conversation with Peggy Sue Amison, and we'll be talking about her experience of the FotoFest Biennial and new projects that she's working on. And so we're really looking forward to those talks, and there will be more There's also, if you go to the FotoFest YouTube page, which is under FotoFest INTL, you will see all of these programs archived, as well as films that we're developing about artists that we've exhibited. There's one on Sammy Balogi, and we have one coming out very shortly on Ida Milena. So those are fun things to watch. Before we sign off, David, can you tell us the website of Chris Graves' projects in case people are interested in getting one of those last copies of the book?
Yes, it is. I should know this off the top of my head, but you can go to chrisgraveprojects.com, and you can also follow him on KG.
ENYC.
Yeah, NYC on Instagram.
And Philip, are there more copies of Witch available?
Yeah, so Witch just came out actually on in late April. So yes, if you go to Alice James Books, you can buy Witch. Petal appears there as well. They're different petal poems. There.
Wonderful. Thanks again. Thank you both so much. Thank you to all the attendees that came in and joined us for this, and have a great evening. It was really nice. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much. This is very meaningful.
Bye-bye.